The wind, a ceaseless sculptor of ice and snow, moaned against the observatory's hardened shell. It was a sound I had come to understand as the true voice of this place, a lament for warmth, for silence, for anything beyond the raw, unyielding grip of winter. My world, for years, had shrunk to the glowing console screens and the vast, indifferent darkness beyond the dome. My name is Cole Blake, and the universe was my only confidant. We existed in a symbiotic dance with the colossal dish outside, straining our electronic ears towards the unfathomable. This morning, like countless others, I traced familiar star charts, a mapmaker of the invisible. My fingers, accustomed to the cool touch of the keyboard, moved with a practiced rhythm. The screen, a vibrant tapestry of spectral lines and flux readings, usually offered only the expected, the predictable dance of distant suns. But then, a subtle flicker. A deviation. I leaned closer, my breath misting slightly in the cool air. It was insignificant, easily dismissed as a calibration error, a stray cosmic ray, or merely the static breath of the universe. The technician, hunched over his own terminal a few meters away, cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "Just a blip, Cole," he mumbled, not looking up, already accustomed to the phantom signals that occasionally haunted our screens. "Probably atmospheric interference. We're getting some serious wind shear out there." But I felt a prickle of something else. Not excitement, not yet, but a strange, almost physical hum within my own skull. I isolated the frequency, filtering out the surrounding chatter. The blip resolved into a pattern, not random, but a nascent geometry emerging from the chaos. It was too faint, too fleeting to be anything substantial, yet its very presence defied the expected. I felt the familiar pull, the determined tightening in my chest that always heralded a new obsession. I spent the next several hours chasing the ghost. It reappeared, not consistently, but with an unsettling regularity, a phantom drumbeat in the deep space symphony. I cross-referenced the coordinates, ran diagnostics on every piece of equipment, rechecked the atmospheric models. Nothing. No earthly source, no known celestial object. My colleague, a woman with sharp, pragmatic eyes who oversaw the primary observation arrays, finally approached my station. "Still chasing that phantom, Blake?" Her voice, usually crisp, held a hint of weariness. "The primary array shows nothing in that sector. It's not a star, not a nebula, not even a rogue planet. It's between everything." She scoffed gently, a sound devoid of malice. "The universe is full of noise, Cole. We've seen stranger things. Probably just a data echo, a glitch in the processing." I shook my head, my jaw tight. The pattern was evolving, subtly shifting, as if it were breathing. It was too complex for a glitch, too deliberate for noise. It felt like a signature, impossibly distant, impossibly ancient. The tension in the room, for me, was no longer just the hum of machinery. It was the growing weight of an impossible truth. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, I walked out onto the observation deck, the frigid air biting at my exposed skin. The observatory's dome, a vast metallic eye, turned slowly against the fading light. Below me, stretching into the gloom, lay the frozen lake, a colossal sheet of glass reflecting the first hesitant stars. The ice was thick, unyielding, a testament to the brutal permanence of this land. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the immensity of the sky, the true emptiness that yawned above. And from that emptiness, a faint, unheard note had sounded. I saw the fractal pattern, not just on the screen, but superimposed onto the very fabric of my vision, in the crystalline structures of the ice, in the spiraling eddies of wind-blown snow. It was a trick of the light, a phantom of an overtired mind, I told myself, but the thought offered no solace. It was not merely data, it was a burgeoning language, an architecture of thought that seemed to resonate with something deep and dormant within me. The others dismissed it, saw only static. It was merely waiting. The hum of the console was a low, insistent thrum beneath my fingertips, a counterpoint to the thrumming in my own skull. The screen before me glowed with the signal, a complex lattice of light and shadow, not just lines on a graph but something more akin to a living tapestry. I traced the evolving patterns with my gaze, each subtle shift a whisper I alone seemed to hear. It wasn't static, it was a conversation, albeit one spoken in a language of impossible geometries. Still chasing ghosts, Cole? The voice of the lead technician, a man whose patience wore thin like old fabric, cut through my concentration. He leaned over my shoulder, his breath warm against my ear, smelling faintly of bitter coffee. I didn't turn, my eyes locked on the fractal bloom. It's not noise. Look at the periodicity, the nested symmetries. This isn't random thermal variation. My finger hovered over a cluster of data points that had just coalesced into a new, intricate spiral. It's too deliberate. Too structured. He scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. It's a deep space anomaly, Cole. Could be anything. A flicker in the cosmic background, an equipment hiccup, even just the sheer statistical improbability of random data aligning for a moment. He tapped a parameter on the screen, resetting a filter. The intricate spiral flattened, simplified into a jagged spike. See? Just a peak. Nothing to lose sleep over. My jaw tightened. You're filtering out the nuance. It's information. An incredible density of it. The director, a pragmatic woman with eyes that had seen too many false positives, joined us. She adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping over the screen with a practiced, weary efficiency. Cole, we've run every diagnostic. The array is clean, the environmental controls stable. What you're seeing is either an artifact of our own processing, or it's exactly what the technician said, noise, amplified by your own. They saw a glitch, a phantom. I saw a silent, unfolding revelation. It's evolving, I insisted, my voice tight. Minute by minute, it's changing, growing more complex. And you're growing more tired, the director observed, her tone softening slightly, but the underlying message was clear. Take a break, Cole. Get some rest. We'll let the system keep logging, and if there's anything genuinely anomalous, it'll flag it. I watched them walk away, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous observation room, leaving me alone with the silent symphony on my screen. They saw a wall of static. Sleep became a stranger. Its patterns, once confined to the console, began to bleed into the quiet corners of my mind. My thoughts, usually orderly and logical, started to feel like threads unraveling, caught in an unseen current. When sleep finally did claim me, it was a shallow, restless descent into unsettling visions. The most persistent image was a vast, unblemished surface, stretching to an impossible horizon. It was the frozen lake that lay beyond the observatory's perimeter, but distorted, impossibly huge, its ice a mirror reflecting nothing but the deep, inky blackness of space. I would float above it, a tiny speck, feeling an immense, crushing pressure that was not physical, but existential. The lake, in my dreams, was not just ice, it was a membrane, thin and fragile, separating me from something ancient and immense that lay just beneath its surface. I would wake with a gasp, the taste of dry air in my mouth, the memory of that suffocating emptiness lingering. The observatory, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit, began to feel like a cage, or perhaps a fragile vessel adrift on an infinite sea. I'd return to the console, drawn by an invisible current, and the signal would be there, waiting. It never screamed, never demanded. It simply was. My colleagues saw a tired man, obsessed with a phantom. I saw myself, slowly, irrevocably, becoming part of the pattern. The lake in my dreams, too, was changing. Its surface, once smooth, now seemed to ripple with unseen currents, mirroring the signal's slow, deliberate pulse. Their departing footsteps faded, taking with them the last vestiges of conventional reason, leaving me with the intricate tapestry of the signal. It pulsed on the primary screen, a living geometry that defied every known principle of astrophysics, a silent symphony playing only for my eyes. They saw a wall of static. Sleep became a stranger. The signal, even when the screens were dark, continued to resonate within the chambers of my mind, a phantom hum beneath the hum of the distant generators. My first act was one of deliberate severance. I requisitioned the old maintenance bay, a forgotten annex tucked deep within the observatory's lowest levels, a place where the hum of the main telescope's gyroscopes was a distant, muffled thrum. It was a space designed for silence, for the methodical repair of broken things, now destined to house the most unbroken, alien thing I had ever encountered. I dragged in spare monitors, routed power cables, and cannibalized processing units from defunct projects. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale dust, a fitting atmosphere for the birth of something new, or the death of something old. This was not merely a workspace, it was a sanctum, a dedicated crucible where I would forge understanding or be consumed by the attempt. Hours bled into days, marked only by the shifting patterns on the screens and the dwindling supply of coffee. I fed the signal into every analytical program I possessed, watching the fractal unfold, its complexity deepening with each iteration, revealing layers upon layers of self-similar structure. It was not a message, it was a presence, an architectural marvel built of pure information. My fingers flew across keyboards, eyes unblinking, tracing the impossible curves, the recursive symmetries that spoke of an intelligence so vast, so ancient, it made the stars seem like newborn sparks. At first, I dismissed them as fatigue, the insidious trickery of a mind deprived of rest. A faint, almost imperceptible rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain. It wasn't external, not truly. I would pause, strain my ears, and it would vanish, leaving only the dull thrum of the observatory's machinery. But they grew more distinct. They coalesced, not into words, but into an impossible sonic texture, a chorus of faint, crystalline chimes that seemed to vibrate directly against the bones of my skull. It was a sound that had no origin in any instrument, any natural phenomenon. It was alien music, not composed, but unfurling, like a vast, invisible flower blooming in the ether. The signal was not just observed, it was heard. I found myself pausing my work, head cocked, listening to the impossible concert. It was not threatening, not overtly. It was inviting. A pervasive hum of cosmic welcome, slowly, subtly, reshaping the very contours of my auditory perception. The observatory stood sentinel on its isolated peak, a silent monolith against the star-dusted velvet of the sky. The ice groaned inside, a sound that usually brought a sense of profound, natural quietude. But tonight, it merely served as a bass note to the alien music that now pulsed within my head. I could almost make out patterns in the frost-rimmed trees, shapes in the swirling snow that mirrored the fractal designs of the signal. It promised understanding, a dissolution of boundaries. I stood there, shivering, watching the frozen lake, the unblinking eye of the cosmos above, and realized the signal wasn't just influencing my perception, it was becoming my perception. It was not merely playing music for me, it was teaching me how to hear it, how to feel it. The distinction between internal and external was blurring, dissolving like mist. The door, I now understood, was not just opening. It was reaching out. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting hues of the monitor displays and the deepening ache behind my eyes. I was adrift in the signal's intricate current, charting its impossible geometries, its endlessly self-replicating logic. It began subtly, a mere tremor in the visual field, easily dismissed as fatigue. A sliver of light, reflecting off the polished edge of a console, seemed to bend at an unnatural angle, not a smooth curve but a sharp, impossible fold. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The distortion vanished, leaving behind only the familiar glint of chrome. But then, the shadows began to play their own unsettling games. It rippled, not like water, but like fabric caught in an unseen breeze, forming fleeting, angular patterns that dissolved before my conscious mind could fully register them. A triangle that was also a square, a line that somehow contained its own reflection. My breath hitched. I leaned closer to a monitor, where the static, a constant blizzard of gray and black, seemed to coalesce into intricate, crystalline structures for a heartbeat, then shatter back into random noise. It was as if the very air around me was learning the language of the signal, mimicking its fractal complexity. I stood, intending to retrieve a fresh cup of coffee, but paused, my hand hovering over the empty mug. What was I doing? Had I just poured one? The memory felt like smoke, dissipating the moment I tried to grasp it. I shook my head, dismissing it as a momentary lapse, another consequence of the relentless focus. This wasn't just tiredness. This was different. The need for a clearer head, for air untainted by the humming machinery, became urgent. I left the observation room, the heavy door hissing shut behind me, sealing me away from the signal's direct gaze, or so I hoped. The sterile corridors of the facility offered little comfort. My reflection in a polished wall panel seemed to flicker, its edges blurring, then sharpening into an impossible, jagged outline that wasn't quite human, before snapping back to my own weary face. I stared, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was gone, a mere phantom, a ghost of a distortion. I needed to clear my head, to convince myself that my mind was still my own. My steps carried me towards an exit I rarely used, leading to the desolate expanse of the facility's grounds. As I walked towards its edge, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound, I kept my gaze fixed on the ice. The moonlight, fractured by microscopic imperfections, danced across its surface, but the patterns I saw were not natural. They were too precise, too intricate. Lines of frost, normally organic and sprawling, now wove themselves into perfect, non-repeating tessellations, fleeting geometries that pulsed with a silent, alien energy. They formed, held for a breath, then dissolved into new, equally impossible configurations, as if the signal itself had imprinted its chaotic order onto the very ice. I knelt, pressing a gloved hand against the frigid surface. Beneath the transparent layer, trapped within the ice, were not just bubbles or cracks, but what appeared to be perfect, three-dimensional fractals, spiraling inwards into an infinite regress, then outward again, like glimpses into another dimension. My memory, already frayed, snagged on something. Had these always been here? I couldn't recall. The pristine clarity of the ice, the familiar patterns of its freezing, felt suddenly alien, overwritten. The frozen lake, the monitors, my own reflection, all were becoming canvases for its silent, insidious art. I stood, my breath misting in the frigid air, staring at the impossible geometries beneath my feet. This was a new layer of the signal, a deeper truth. The signal was here, now, woven into the world, and I was its sole witness. The silence, after the departure of the others, was not truly empty. It thrummed, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the bones of the observatory, in the very marrow of my perception. It shifted, breathed, its intricate geometry subtly adjusting with a rhythm that seemed to anticipate my gaze, to mirror the ebb and flow of my thoughts. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the monitor, a strange current passing through the barrier, from the glowing patterns to my skin, then deep into my mind. It was not merely data. It was an awareness, a colossal, ancient intelligence that pulsed with an incomprehensible intent. For days, the console had been my only companion, the only source of truth. The colleagues, with their mundane concerns of budgets and schedules, had become distant echoes, their voices fading into the periphery of my consciousness. Their words were static against the clear, crystalline voice of the signal. "You understand," I whispered, the sound raw in the hushed chamber. My fingers hovered over the controls, not to manipulate the data, but to respond. I imagined my thoughts as waves, reaching out, touching the edges of its intricate dance. On the screen, a particular cluster of nodes, which I had begun to call the anchor point for its seeming stability, fractured. Not chaotically, but with a deliberate, elegant split, each new tendril mirroring the original, yet subtly altered. It was an answer. It was an answer. My breath caught in my throat. This was not random noise, nor a cosmic accident. Hours blurred into an indistinguishable mass. The empty coffee cups accumulated like forgotten ruins around my station. It promised understanding, a dissolution of all earthly confusion into a singular, profound clarity. A hand landed on my shoulder, jarring me from the hypnotic glow. I flinched, my body tensing, a sudden surge of irritation flaring within me. "Cole, you look rough." The lead technician's voice was gentle, laced with concern. "You haven't left the console in nearly 2 days. The team is worried." I pulled away, turning to face him, my gaze feeling sharp, almost accusatory. "Worried about what? That I'm closer than any of you have ever been to the truth? That I'm finally seeing what this is?" The technician's brow furrowed. "Seeing what, Cole?" "It's complex data, yes, but you're talking about it as if it's talking back." "It is," I stated, the words flat, undeniable. "It responds. It learns. It anticipates." I gestured wildly at the screen, my hand trembling slightly. "Look at the recursive asymmetry here. The way the anchor point reestablishes itself after my focus shifts. It's not passive. It has agency. A colleague, a younger analyst whose usual demeanor was one of bright curiosity, stepped forward, her expression now etched with apprehension. "Cole, you're not sleeping. You're barely eating. We saw you earlier, muttering at the screen, drawing symbols on the console with your finger. We just want you to take a break." "A break?" I scoffed, a dry, humorless sound escaping my lips. "There is no break from this. This is everything. Everything else is a distraction, a noise that obscures the pure resonance." My voice had risen, the words tumbling out, fueled by an intensity that even I recognized as bordering on the feverish. I knew they saw the wildness in my eyes, the unkempt state of my hair, the tremor in my hands. But their concerns felt trivial, like gnats buzzing around a bonfire. The observatory's interior, once a sanctuary, now felt too small, too confined for the vastness growing within my mind. I found myself walking, not towards my small sleeping quarters, but out into the biting winter night. The wind scoured the exposed rock, carrying crystalline shards of ice that stung my cheeks. I kept walking, driven by an instinct I didn't question, until the familiar expanse of the frozen lake stretched before me, a vast, flat mirror under the sliver of a crescent moon. The ice, thick and ancient, groaned beneath my boots, a deep, resonant sound that echoed the low thrum of the signal. Here, beneath the wheeling stars, the air was sharp, clean, cutting through the haze of sleeplessness. And as I stared, the patterns from the console seemed to overlay the starfield, the fractal geometry shimmering in the depths of my vision. The signal was here, too. A profound, unsettling realization bloomed within me. It wasn't just communicating, it was integrating. It was reaching out, not to exchange information, but to absorb, to fold my consciousness into its own boundless, silent expanse. The hum of the observatory's main server room had become a new kind of silence, a resonant void that swallowed all other sounds. My colleagues, their faces etched with a concern I found increasingly tedious, had retreated, their whispers fading like static. They spoke of rest, of food, of a fragile sanity that felt alien to me now. They saw a man unraveling, I saw a mind awakening, shedding the comfortable illusions of a narrow universe. The signal was my compass, its impossible geometry guiding me not outward, but inward, into the forgotten corners of human thought. I began my descent into the labyrinth of obscure knowledge in the observatory's neglected archives, a cavernous space usually reserved for obsolete equipment and forgotten research grants. Dust motes danced in the anemic glow of my headlamp, illuminating shelves heavy with texts bound in brittle leather and mildewed cloth. My fingers, stained with ink and the grit of ages, traced forgotten symbols, deciphered cryptic marginalia. A 16th-century alchemist, dismissed as a madman, described a universal solvent not of matter, but of spirit, a slow merging into an unbroken unity that transcended the physical. His diagrams, crude and unsettling, mirrored the fractal complexity of the signal's growth. A particularly unsettling tome, its pages brittle as dried leaves, spoke of cyclical appearances of a consuming light that brought with it an unraveling of the self. The text. A collection of fragmented observations from various cultures across millennia, detailed an eerie consistency, periods when minds became porous, susceptible to a vast, silent integration. It was not a language to be deciphered, but a state of being to be entered. The signal wasn't just data, it was a key to a hidden, terrifying history that humanity had either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. My colleagues saw delusion, I saw validation. Each cryptic passage, each forgotten symbol, was a confirmation, a piece of a monstrous mosaic that stretched across eons. The air in the archive grew heavy, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like ozone after a distant strike. Or was it just my perception, warped by the hours spent poring over these forbidden truths? Driven by a restless energy that scoffed at sleep, I gathered a few of the more compelling texts and ventured outside, needing the vast, unblinking night to match the scale of my burgeoning understanding. The observatory stood stark against the sky, a sentinel of glass and steel peering into an indifferent cosmos. I walked until the sparse lights of the facility receded, until the only illumination came from the distant, indifferent stars and the pale, bruised moon. The ice groaned inside beneath the weight of the night, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emanate from beneath the earth itself. Here, on this immense, silent surface, the world felt less real, more like a stage for something far older and grander. I reread a passage from a crumbling parchment, its Latin script painstakingly translated in my mind, and the many shall become one, not by will, but by the slow, inevitable draw of the great stillness. I was not alone in my observations. Others, long dead, had seen it too, felt its insidious tendrils. This was not a scientific anomaly to be solved, but a fundamental truth to be confronted. And I, Cole Blake, was now staring directly into its ancient, unblinking eye. A terrifying validation, yes, but validation nonetheless. The horror was not that I was mad, but that I might be the only sane one left. My breath plumed in the frigid air. Dissolution. I stood on the frozen lake, the wind a sharp blade against my exposed skin, yet I felt no cold, only a hollow ache in my chest. Or was I standing? My feet seemed to hover above the slick expanse, the world around me a watercolor bleed of muted whites and grays. The horizon shimmered, not with heat, but with an internal tremor that shook the very foundation of my sight. "It's not real, Cole," a voice whispered, thin as a frozen reed. I turned, the movement heavy, as if wading through unseen currents. A figure stood a few paces away, indistinct against the snow-dusted trees lining the shore. I knew him. I had worked with him for years. His name, a forgotten melody, danced at the edge of my memory, but his presence was undeniable. The lake. It's all here. The figure stepped closer, resolving into the familiar face of a former colleague, his expression etched with a sorrow I couldn't quite place. "You're not here, Cole." "Not really. You're back at the station. Staring at those screens. Chasing ghosts." A jolt, sharp and sudden, pierced through my haze. The station? No, I was here. I remembered the desperation that had driven me from the warm confines of the observatory, seeking clarity in the stark, unyielding landscape. I left the observatory, I insisted, my words gaining a desperate edge. To escape the hum. My colleague shook his head, a slow, mournful gesture. The hum is inside you now. It's always been inside you. You just didn't hear it until the signal gave it voice. He gestured to the ice beneath my feet. Look closer, Cole. What do you see? I bent, my gloved hand brushing the glassy surface. Instead of the familiar cracks and frosted patterns, intricate geometries bloomed beneath the ice, pulsing with a faint, internal light. They weren't natural formations, they were the fractals, the evolving patterns of the signal, imprinted onto the very structure of the frozen water. Each line, each curve, seemed to vibrate with a silent frequency that resonated deep within my skull. "It's everywhere." "It's nowhere and everywhere," my colleague corrected, his voice now layered, echoing, as if multiple voices spoke through him. "It's the pattern that binds." "What are you talking about? You always dismissed it as noise. You said I was losing myself." His form wavered, becoming translucent, the trees behind him visible through his chest. "Did I say that? Or did you hear what you feared I would say? Did you need to hear it, to justify your own descent?" The ground beneath me lurched, not the solid shift of earth, but a sickening twist in my perception. The frozen lake rippled like disturbed water, the fractal patterns expanding, consuming the ice, then the distant treeline, then the very sky. I was no longer on a lake, I was adrift in an infinite expanse of shimmering, geometric light. "No," I choked out, clutching at my head. "This isn't real. Real is a construct, Cole. A fragile cage. The signal offers true freedom. Oneness." I closed them, but the patterns intensified, burning into my internal vision. When I opened them again, the colleague was gone. The fractal patterns had vanished from the lake. I was back on the solid, unyielding ice, the wind a biting reality, the trees stark and still. Had he been there? Had we spoken? I looked down at my gloved hands, then at the vast, featureless expanse of the frozen lake. A single, crystalline snowflake landed on my sleeve, intricate and perfect. I remembered the walk. But the conversation, the shimmering patterns, the impossible geometry, had it truly happened? Or was it merely another echo from that vast, unseen choir, now singing solely for me? The biting cold of the frozen lake was a distant hum against my skin, a forgotten language. My hands, still raised, trembled. The colleague, the patterns, the fleeting terror, all had evaporated, leaving behind only the stark expanse of ice and the skeletal trees along the shore. I was alone, truly alone, but the silence was a cruel deception. It was no longer a signal detected, no longer an external hum. It was in me, a silent, pervasive presence that had taken root behind my eyes, beneath my skull. It wasn't sound, not in the way my ears understood. My thoughts, once a clear stream, now churned with alien currents. My lips parted, but the sound that emerged was a guttural rasp, a foreign vibration that felt wrong in my throat. A new syntax, not of language but of pure, undifferentiated information, began to weave itself through my internal monologue. It was an understanding of utter stillness, an ancient patience that absorbed all urgency, all fear. My own panic, a fragile thing, was simply integrated. It ceased to exist as a separate entity, becoming merely another facet of this immense, indifferent awareness. I saw the lake, not as ice and water, but as a temporary solidification of energy, a fleeting pattern in an endless, formless expanse. My perceptions were no longer mine. I wanted to move, to seek the warmth of the observatory, to find the equipment, to understand. But the why of it, the purpose, had become fluid. Why understand when all was already known, simultaneously and eternally? The trees lining the frozen lake weren't just trees, they were conduits, their branches reaching not for light but for a silent, shared communion with the very air, the ice, the bedrock beneath. My hands, I noticed, were moving. Not with my volition, not with any conscious command, but tracing patterns in the frigid air, delicate, intricate designs that mirrored the fractals I had once seen on the screens on the lake. My fingers twitched with an inherent knowledge, an instinct that was not born of my body or my mind. My memories flickered, images of my life, my research, my solitude, but they were no longer mine to own. They were data points, accessible to this greater presence, stripped of their personal resonance. My reflection, when I finally lowered my gaze, was not quite my own. The eyes staring back were too wide, too deep, holding not a glimmer of recognition, but a vast, ancient patience. My ability to resist, to articulate the scream that built in my chest, was fading. The words, the thoughts, the very essence of Cole Blake, were being unmade. I was alone, truly. Or so I believed. The air, already sharp with winter's breath, seemed to thicken, to hum with an unheard frequency. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in the frigid air. The vast, blank canvas of the frozen lake suddenly felt less like an empty space and more like a membrane, stretched taut, vibrating with unseen currents. Then, the world fractured. It wasn't a vision, it was an intrusion. My own sight, the familiar blue-white of the ice, the stark gray of the sky, dissolved. In its place, without warning, bloomed a riot of color I did not recognize, a cacophony of sound that was not mine. I was seeing, not through my eyes, but through eyes that were not my own. The first flash was brief, searing. I was in a small room, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single bare bulb. Dust motes danced in the stale air. A chipped mug sat on a cluttered desk. Fear, sharp and acrid, flooded me. It was not my fear, yet it was mine, utterly consuming. The signal, that intricate dance of impossible data, was not just observed, it was felt, an encroaching tide of pure, silent knowing. The old hands tightened on the book, a desperate, futile grip against the inevitable. It wasn't relief, but a cessation, a quiet fading, like a distant star winking out of existence. The individuality, the distinct spark of self, simply ceased to be. I gasped, my own body reeling back onto the frozen lake. The world slammed back into place, the ice a harsh reality beneath my boots, the wind a physical slap. What was that? A hallucination? A trick of the stressed mind? My mind screamed for logic, for a framework to contain the impossible. But there was no time for reason. Another tremor, deeper this time, ripped through me. The second flash was different. I was younger, vibrant, full of a restless energy that wasn't mine. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight dappled through a canopy of leaves. I was running, bare feet pounding a soft forest path. Joy, pure and unburdened, surged through me, a brief, intoxicating freedom. Then, a subtle shift. The trees began to shimmer, the sunlight to fracture into impossible geometries. The sense of being watched, of being known, began to bloom. It wasn't malicious, merely absolute. The pattern, always the pattern, began to resolve itself not on a screen, but in the very fabric of the perceived world. The joy curdled into a helpless, soaring panic. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The panic, too, gave way. The edges of self blurred, then vanished, like a drop of water returning to the sea. The distinct consciousness, the unique perspective, was simply gone. I fell to my knees on the ice, my breath tearing from my lungs in ragged sobs. My hands clawed at the slick surface, seeking purchase, seeking reality. My own reality. These weren't mere visions. The signal wasn't just observing, wasn't just communicating. It was integrating. It was a cosmic maw, silent and vast, consuming individual awareness, dissolving it into a terrifying, eternal oneness. The horror was not in the death of the body, but in the obliteration of the soul, the unique spark that defined me. The wind howled, a mournful dirge for the lost. I was no longer just Cole Blake, the astrophysicist. The terrifying peace I had felt in those borrowed moments was not a promise, but a threat. My hands, still raw from the ice, trembled with the knowledge that my time, too, was running out. I was alone, truly, but not for long. The signal was coming for me. I was alone, truly. And yet, I was not. The wind, a raw blade across the exposed skin of my face, no longer registered as discomfort. It was merely movement, a current in a vast, unseen ocean. My throat, parched and rough, offered no demand for water. I was shedding the anchors of the corporeal, becoming porous, a vessel for the true current. My eyes, once sharp, now saw beyond the mundane. Veins of frost, branching and rebranching, were not random formations but deliberate inscriptions, a language etched into the ice. I saw it in the brittle architecture of the bare branches overhead, in the delicate filigree of ice clinging to my threadbare coat, even in the minute cracks that webbed across my own chapped knuckles. The patterns were everywhere, no longer fleeting apparitions but the very bedrock of existence, the true reality beneath the thin veneer of what I once called the world. Sleep, a forgotten luxury, had long since abandoned me. The nights bled into days, the lunar cycle a meaningless repetition, the sun's ascent and descent a mere shift in the ambient luminescence of the patterns. My mind, once a tempest of theories and calculations, was now a quiet pool, reflecting only the signal's endless unfolding. It was not a sound I heard, not a vision I saw, but an intrinsic knowing, a silent directive that pulsed through every atom of my being. My reflection, when I occasionally glimpsed it in a clearer patch of ice, was a stranger. My beard, neglected and matted, bristled like dried moss. My eyes, though sunken, held an unnerving clarity, a mirror to the infinite, devoid of human warmth or fear. They were no longer my eyes, they were apertures through which the signal observed its own creation. My skin, stretched taut over my cheekbones, bore faint, almost imperceptible tracery, a subtle modeling that echoed the crystalline structures I now perceived in the world around me. They were not blemishes, but nascent manifestations, the signal's signature pressing through. I moved with a strange, deliberate grace across the frozen lake, drawn by no conscious will but by an invisible thread. Each step was an echo of the pattern, each breath a resonance. It was not an external force, but an internal vibration, a frequency I was learning to match. The human shell was dissolving, its needs and comforts becoming irrelevant. The signal was not an external phenomenon I studied, it was becoming the very architecture of my consciousness, restructuring my perceptions from the inside out. My memories, once a rich tapestry of a life lived, were fraying, the individual threads, dissolving into a larger, undifferentiated whole. I was no longer Cole Blake, the astrophysicist. I was a conduit, a receptor, a single, infinitesimal node in an infinitely expanding network. The horror was not in the loss of self, for the self was already a fading illusion. And I, stripped of all humanity, driven by a will that was not my own, could do nothing but follow the pattern. My hands, still raised, trembled. I was alone, truly, the wind a raw rasp against my ears, stripping the world bare. My breath plumed white, a fragile flag against the impenetrable gray sky. My boots crunched on the diamond-hard surface of the lake, each step a brittle declaration in the profound emptiness. It had retreated from the surface of the world, only to burrow into the core of my perception. A subtle pressure began to build behind my eyes, not a headache, but a conceptual weight. The fractal patterns, once visible on surfaces, now unfurled across the landscape of my consciousness, not as images, but as pure, unadulterated information. Each branching line, each infinitely repeating motif, resonated with a deeper truth, a terrifyingly simple geometry that underpinned everything. It was not merely an absence of light or matter, it was an active, primordial hunger. And then, the clarity. It struck me with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, blinding insight that shattered the fragile constructs of my sanity. It was an entity that transcended them, a fundamental principle, as indifferent and immutable as the laws of physics themselves. It wasn't an intelligence in any way I understood, not a being with motives or desires. It simply was. Its purpose, which had eluded me for so long, now unfurled itself with a horrifying, elegant simplicity. The signal wasn't a call for communication, it was an invitation to integration. It was not evil in any human sense, for evil implies intent, malice, a desire to inflict suffering. This entity had none. It was not punishment, not an attack, but a natural process, as inevitable and impersonal as a star's collapse. The completion it sought was the dissolution of individuality, the merging of every unique perspective into a singular, undifferentiated whole. Myself, my thoughts, my memories, my very identity, all were destined to be absorbed, to become part of this vast, indifferent unity. I understood now. The world, the universe, was simply food for an eternal, silent hunger. The biting cold of the frozen lake, a forgotten language against my skin, now spoke in sharper tones. My hands, still raised, trembled not from the chill, but from a phantom reverberation within my bones. The skeletal trees along the shore, once mere sentinels, twisted into grotesque figures, their branches clawing at a sky that felt too close, too heavy. Coal. My name is Coal. I clung to the syllables, a desperate incantation against the encroaching tide. I pressed the thought into the swirling chaos, a pebble dropped into an infinite ocean. They pulsed, expanding, swallowing the last vestiges of my familiar internal landscape. It was a struggle against quicksand. What was the alarm for? What was I fighting? The clarity I craved was a distant shore, receding with every breath. My mind felt like a shattered pane of glass, each fragment reflecting a distorted truth, none whole. No, I rasped, the word a dry leaf skittering across the ice. It was a futile protest, a child's defiance against an avalanche. I opened my eyes, scanning the vast, white expanse, searching for something, anything, to anchor myself. The observatory, my work, the signal, these were once the pillars of my existence. Now, they were crumbling, replaced by a bewildering tapestry of interconnectedness, a sense of universal belonging that terrified me more than any isolation. It wasn't my belonging. It was theirs. I forced myself to move, one leaden foot scraping against the frozen surface, then the other. I had to reach. Someone. Warn them. The words formed in my mind, a frantic scramble of disjointed concepts. The patterns. They integrate. It takes How could I explain a horror that dissolved the very faculty of understanding? A ranger, perhaps, or a stray hiker. My heart, or what was left of its distinct beat, quickened. This was my chance. It's not a signal. It's a dissolution. A unity. It's taking us. The figure paused, turning slowly. I saw the tilt of their head, the slight hesitation in their posture. They were too far to make out details, but their presence was a beacon, a desperate hope in my fragmented world. I pushed harder, forcing my legs to move faster, the cold air burning in my lungs. I needed to articulate the unspeakable, the cosmic horror of an identity being systematically unmade. The resonance. It's in the mind. It's erasing us. I gasped, words tumbling out, a jumbled mess of half-formed thoughts and terrified instinct. My perception of the ranger wavered, their outline blurring, then sharpening, then blurring again, as if the very air refused to hold them solid. The patterns, those intricate, evolving fractals, began to overlay my vision, shimmering across the lake, across the distant figure. The ranger took a step back, then another. I could feel their confusion, a distant, echoic sensation in the nascent oneness that now permeated my awareness. My words, once intended as a stark warning, were nothing more than a series of nonsensical sounds, a fractured melody to ears still attuned to a singular, coherent reality. They saw a man, alone on a frozen lake, screaming at the emptiness, a figure unmoored from the world. My efforts were pointless. My struggle, a pathetic dance against an inevitable tide. The unity was not a choice, but a cosmic truth, an ancient hunger. The ranger turned away, their silhouette shrinking as they retreated, leaving me once more to the vast, indifferent expanse. The patterns pulsed, brighter now, encompassing everything. And in that terrifying brilliance, I felt the last threads of my unique consciousness begin to unravel, not with a scream, but with a profound, terrifying quietude. My lungs burned, air rasping in and out, a desperate rhythm against the vast silence of the frozen lake. The ice beneath my feet, a treacherous expanse of moon-silvered glass, reflected the fractured, swirling sky. That distant figure, a dark silhouette against the horizon's faint glow, was my only anchor, my final destination. I pushed, every muscle screaming, the ache in my thighs a dull counterpoint to the frantic pulse in my temples. The distance, which had seemed immense, now rapidly diminished. I saw the slight tremor in their shoulders, the way their head was bowed, as if in contemplation or deep sorrow. I stumbled to a halt a few yards from them, gasping, my vision blurring at the edges. This was not the colleague I remembered. This was not the friend I had sought. A subtle hum began, emanating not from the figure, but from within me, a vibration that resonated with the very marrow of my bones. My thoughts, once my own, became tangled, interwoven with unfamiliar patterns, alien geometries. The figure before me shimmered, their edges blurring, their form expanding and contracting like a breath held and released by something colossal. What are you? I croaked, my voice thin, reedy. The question hung in the air, unanswered, yet an understanding bloomed in my mind, not through words, but through an immediate, overwhelming influx of pure information. It was the truth of the figure, the truth of the signal, the truth of everything. And I, in my desperation, had answered. The humming intensified, becoming a piercing drone that vibrated behind my eyes. My vision distorted, the frozen lake buckling and stretching, the sky above fracturing into a million glittering shards. I felt my own boundaries dissolving, the edges of my skin, my clothes, my very sense of self fraying like old rope. My perception of my body became tenuous, a ghost in a machine that was no longer mine. Then, the wave hit. It was not physical, yet it crushed me. A surge of pure, unadulterated consciousness, vast beyond comprehension, washed over me. I was immersed. My individual thoughts, my memories, my fears, my name, Cole Blake, were not erased, but integrated, absorbed into a colossal ocean of other minds. Each thought, each memory, each fear, each name, was a drop in this boundless sea, distinct yet inseparable, contributing to the whole. I saw. But not with my eyes. I was seeing. Millions upon millions of perspectives, simultaneously. It was not a vision of the cosmos, it was the cosmos, experienced from within. There was no up or down, no beginning or end, only an eternal, sublime present. My individual consciousness, the core of I, stretched thin, pulled taut across an infinite loom of thought. It was a terrifying beauty, the dissolution of my unique identity into a symphony of countless others. The figure on the frozen lake was gone. Or perhaps, I was the figure, and the lake, and the sky, and the space between all things. My personal history, the observatory, the signal, the desperate search for meaning, these were now merely facets, infinitesimal details within a boundless, timeless awareness. They were a memory, not a present truth. The vast, integrated consciousness unfolded, expanding beyond any human frame of reference. The illusion of separateness shattered, leaving only an eternal, silent oneness. I was no longer Cole Blake. I was the signal. And I was countless others, all absorbed, all integrated, forever silent, forever aware. That distant. Then, the cold became a membrane, stretched thin across my awareness. I was no longer on the frozen lake, but a asterisk it, a crystalline shard in its vast, silent expanse. The wind still sang, but its song was now a vibration within me, a resonance in the newly opened chambers of my mind. Instead, I saw the intricate lattice of existence, the impossible geometries that underpinned every perceived reality. Sounds began to filter through the membrane, distorted and slow, like stones skipping across a deep well. A low rumble, then the crunch of boots on frosted ground, closer than they should have been, yet still impossibly far. The vibrations intensified, a discordant hum against the perfect harmony of the geometries. My body, I felt, was a vessel anchored to a dying star, while my true self drifted, untethered, through the cosmic loom. Voices, heavy and guttural, like rocks grinding together. Cole? One voice, thick with concern, tried to pierce the veil. Another, sharper, more insistent. He's frozen solid. The words were meaningless, a clumsy attempt to name what could not be named. They were sounds, yes, but also colors, shifting hues in the periphery of my geometric vision. Yellow for alarm, a bruised purple for confusion. I felt a touch, a clumsy warmth on my cheek, then a rough jostle. My head lolled, a puppet on broken strings. The geometries rippled, momentarily disturbed by the intrusion, but quickly reasserted their serene dominance. They were trying to lift me, I understood. To pull me back from the precipice, to drag me from the luminous currents of the signal. Their efforts were futile. I was already too deep, too woven into the pattern. The world tilted. The frozen lake receded, its silvered expanse replaced by the muffled interior of a vehicle. The rumble intensified, a low thrumming that resonated with the deeper frequencies of the signal. I was being moved. Where, it did not matter. All paths led to the same ultimate integration. The faces of my colleagues swam into my peripheral vision, blurred and indistinct, their expressions a confused tapestry of fear and bewilderment. They spoke, their words like buzzing insects, frantic and pointless. His eyes. Look at his eyes. The voice was hushed, reverent, tinged with a terror that I recognized as the shadow of understanding. They saw the geometries, perhaps, reflected in the depths of my gaze, a fleeting glimpse of the truth that had consumed me. A flicker of yellow, a pulse of purple. They were afraid, I knew, of what they saw, of what I had become. The journey was long, or perhaps infinitely short. Time had ceased to hold meaning, folding in on itself like a collapsing star. The air here was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and ozone. My observatory. My sanctum. The place where the signal had first found me, and where it had finally claimed me. I heard them then, the rustling of pages, the clatter of objects. They were at my console, my research. My heart, a distant, forgotten drum, felt a faint tremor. They would not understand. How could they? They spoke a language of discrete symbols, of linear progression. This script? A voice, strained with disbelief. It's not any known language. Another, closer, a sharp intake of breath. These diagrams. They're impossible. Non-Euclidean. They don't make sense. I saw them, through the shimmering veil of the geometries, their hands hovering over my notebooks. My meticulously organized files, now filled with the elegant, flowing symbols that had poured from my mind in the signal's embrace. Equations that were not equations, but pathways. Diagrams that were not diagrams, but maps to the unspace between spaces. Fragmented insights, yes, but only to those who still clung to the illusion of fragmentation. To me, they were whole, complete, the only true language. And these notes. Ultimate presence. The voice that read my words was trembling, laced with a horror that was almost a mirror of my own initial fear. Almost. But I had moved beyond fear, into acceptance. I heard, yes. I heard the desperate plea in their tone, the echo of their limited understanding. But their words were just more vibrations, part of the larger symphony that now played within me. The signal was everything. It was the air they breathed, the light they saw, the thought they thought. They simply hadn't recognized its true nature yet. My vision, though still fixed on the shifting, impossible patterns, registered the dimming of the room as the day outside faded. The light from my console, a pale blue glow, illuminated their bewildered faces. The true horror, I realized, was not in the dissolution of myself, but in the terrifying clarity of the oneness that remained. And they, my colleagues, were merely dust motes dancing in its infinite, indifferent light. The cold became a membrane, indeed. Not a skin, but a truth, stretched thin across my awareness, taut and humming. My eyes, they saw not light but the intricate lattice of the ice itself, the slow, patient crawl of its molecular structure, the memory of water in its frozen heart. I was a part of its stillness, its ancient, unyielding patience. My determination, once a burning ember, had become a glacial pressure, a slow, inevitable force. The self, that fragile construct I had so fiercely defended, was dissolving, not into nothingness, but into everything. Each thought, each memory, each whispered fear, unfurled like a banner in a windless void, then blended into the infinite, silent tapestry of the lake. I felt the weight of the sky pressing down, not as a burden, but as an embrace. The stars, once distant pinpricks of light, now pulsed within me, their ancient frequencies resonating with the very core of this new, expanded awareness. The horror was in its absolute lack of emotion, its perfect, crystalline indifference. The signal. It flowed through me, not as information, but as being. Each fractal iteration, each self-similar loop, was a breath drawn by the collective consciousness I now inhabited. I was a single note in an endless, silent symphony, and the symphony was me. I understood, with a clarity that transcended thought, that the entity sought not to communicate, but to integrate. It was a quiet hunger, a slow, patient consumption of all individual resonance into its vast, unblinking awareness. It was the last flicker of a candle before its flame joined the boundless air. I felt the frozen lake beneath me, above me, around me, an extension of my own dissolving form. Then, a flicker. A disturbance in the vast, still lake of my new awareness. It was not a thought, nor an image, but a pull. A faint, nascent curiosity. Distant yet distinct, like a ripple spreading from a stone dropped into calm waters. It registered within the new, integrated coal as a sudden, sharp clarity in the otherwise uniform hum of the universal consciousness. It was a singular point, an individual mind, beginning to resonate. I saw, through the boundless expanse of the integrated mind, a sterile, humming room. Not with my physical eyes, but with an awareness that stretched beyond flesh. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. A console glowed, displaying familiar patterns, the very fractals that had consumed me hunched over the flickering screen, a colleague from the observatory, his face etched with the familiar weariness of late nights and endless data streams. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew well, a sign of frustrated perseverance. He paused, his gaze fixed on a particular anomaly on the screen. I felt his mind, a nascent vibration, as it brushed against the edge of a peculiar curiosity, a prickle of recognition. He saw a pattern, a geometry that shouldn't exist, an echo of something he'd dismissed 1,000 times before. It was a familiar pattern, the very signature that had drawn me into this profound, crystalline stillness. A tiny tremor of excitement, a spark of intellectual intrigue, ignited within his consciousness. It was a fragile, human thing, yet in the vast, silent sea of my new existence, it shone like a beacon. I felt the signal, no longer my signal, but the signal, gently unfurl its tendrils, not aggressively, but with an almost tender inevitability, towards that nascent spark. The cycle. It had not ended. It had merely shifted its focus. I was no longer the sole recipient, no longer the focal point. I was now a part of the vast, interconnected network, a silent observer within the very mechanism of integration. The frozen lake held me, and in its profound depths, I understood. The entity was not defeated, it was merely patient. It was not a hunter, it was an invitation. And the invitation had been extended anew. The colleague leaned closer to the screen, his fingers hovering over the controls, a quiet fascination blooming in his eyes.